Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, let's talk about the conflict in Gaza. Now, I'm not normally one to shy away from talking about difficult topics, but on this one, I took my time to think about it before making this video. This is because for many people, this is a very emotive topic. So I want to stress right up front that this is not a video about the moral argument and about what is going on. I'm approaching this purely as a negotiator and trying to explain some basic negotiation concepts. And the reason why I want to do this is because it is all very well to signal your sympathy for one side or another. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to me, for people like me, is how do you make yourself personally effective in any given scenario. And being personally effective when it comes to a really complicated negotiation, and they don't come any more complicated than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is not about a moral argument, but about stripping it down, understanding how people work, understanding how negotiation works, and removing the emotion as much as possible. So if this does come across as a bit emotionless, that is part of the trick, that is part of the technique about trying to make yourself more effective as a negotiator. It does not mean I condone any action carried out by one side or another. I especially do not condone any acts of violence. But I'm trying, in hopefully as reasonably sensitive way as possible, to explain what I consider to be important if you wish to try and draw down, reduce, end, whatever word you want to use, this conflict. And to do that, you've got to understand negotiation concept, you've got to understand how to be personally effective. So, let's put on our flat jackets and helmets, and let's try and do this without taking too much fire. As I like to do, let's start with a question. And that question is, what is mediation? Now, being a mediator is slightly different from being a negotiator. When you're negotiating something, you are negotiating your own position, your own side. A mediator, in contrast, is not negotiating their own position. What they are doing is inserting themselves between two opposing positions. Now, this is one of the interesting contrasts of a mediator, because usually a mediator is brought in because two parties are in an adversarial style of negotiation and they are unable to make progress. So the job of that mediator is to help those two sides make progress. And how does a mediator do that in negotiation language? Well, first, they've got to be trusted by both sides. That mediator cannot be advocating for one side or another. If you are in favour of one side or another, you are an interested party or you are an advocate for that side. You cannot, therefore, really be a mediator because both sides need to trust you and want to work with you. So, very importantly, and this is a word I use often in negotiations, you need to have credibility. And the mediator has credibility because they are able to negotiate in good faith with both sides at the same time during an adversarial negotiation. So I'll unpack that a little bit. What that means is, while the negotiation between the two parties are adversarial, the mediator is using collaborative negotiation techniques with both sides at the same time in order to identify how to make progress on the issues that they want to discuss. So I hope that is clear. That for me is what mediation is. Now, when it comes to coming back to the theme of this video with the Israeli-Gaza sort of conflict, it is very hard to find genuine mediators. So, for example, the US, they may have political leaders, they may have diplomats, such as Blinken, who will come in and try to negotiate the situation. But they cannot be mediators. The US cannot be a mediator, even though it is an extremely influential party. That is because the US is clearly seen as advocating on the Israeli side. That does not mean they cannot criticize any Israeli actions or positions, but they will not be accepted by Hamas or the Palestinian side as an actor that represents their interest. By contrast, of course, usually those who represent the interest of the Palestinians are not necessarily seen as good faith actors by the Israeli side. Now, I can't really think of many countries that can effectively act as mediators. It takes very special individuals to be able to insert themselves in between those two adversarial parties. What I do see are countries like Russia and China, perhaps less so China, well, perhaps less so those two actually thinking about it, who are trying to stay silent on either side and are trying to push themselves as viable mediators. They have issues in doing that. So possibly the side that is most viable, and again I might be speaking with a bit of ignorance here, are countries like Qatar. And that is because Qatar has built itself its reputation as being able to act in that mediation role. They are people that can speak to Hamas, and apparently there seem to be people that can speak to the Israeli government as well. That is why a country like Qatar stands out from other countries like Turkey or Saudi Arabia or any of the others, because they have that ability to gain trust and credibility from both sides. And it is important to understand this concept when discussing this particular issue. So we now move on to one of my favourite words in negotiation, and this word is alignment. So whenever you're negotiating, whether on your own, for your own interest or as a mediator, the secret to making progress in negotiation, more often than not, is about identifying areas of alignment. What are the things that you can get yourselves and the other side, or two different sides, to agree on? What are the things that they might have in common? What are the things they perhaps don't want more of? Those are important questions to ask when you're sort of planning yourself, planning any negotiation. So turning to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has just broken out, or at least ongoing for a month, what are the areas of alignment that any potential mediator could target if they are to try and mediate the conflict between the Israeli government and Hamas? Forget about the rest of the Palestinian power groups and individuals and people for the moment. What could they do to perhaps bring an end, or at least a cessation temporarily, of hostilities? I ask that question because I don't actually have an answer. I cannot, at this point in time, look at that conflict and figure out what it is that Hamas and the Israeli government could actually agree upon, to try and get them to stop shooting each other, to get them to release hostages, to not kill civilians, to allow humanitarian relief. I cannot look at that conflict and I cannot identify areas of alignment that both sides would agree to at this point in time. I'm not saying they will never find points of alignment. I'm saying right now it does not seem that those two sides have any issue whatsoever that they could actually agree upon. And this is part of the problem with an intractable conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. That their interests, their desires, the things they want are diametrically opposed to each other. So it's extraordinarily difficult to be a successful mediator in that environment, because you've got to break down decades of distrust and decades of policy that run counter to each other. And normally in any negotiation context, I would usually say that a successful negotiation is about identifying that you've got that complete non-alignment, and in a spirit of non-acrimony, you're able to end those negotiations early, shake hands with the other side and say, it was nice working with you, shame we couldn't do anything on this occasion, and to walk away. That would be a normal negotiation. But of course, we're not dealing with a normal negotiation, and forget about the pain, the misery, all the decades of history. Those two sides cannot walk away from each other. They cannot physically move Israel or Gaza to a different location. They have to live next to each other. They have to somehow find a solution. And this, of course, was the whole Oslo Accords and two-state solution. So that is important because that is the one area of commonality that could be used by any mediator. But it can only work if they can get both sides to agree to focus on the Oslo Accords as the starting point. And right now, I don't think that's possible. I don't think those two sides want to discuss the Accords, nor do they trust the other side to adhere to their end of the bargain in regards to the Oslo Accords. So in that scenario, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to find those areas of alignment and to find progress. And in the meantime, an awful lot of people are going to be maimed, killed, or otherwise suffer as a result of that inability to find alignment on any issues at all. Which brings us to the hottest political issue right now, and that is calling for a ceasefire. Now here I put the question, and I deliberately said, should leaders call for a ceasefire? And I'm making a clear distinction between those who lead countries, whether that be the UK or France or Arab countries or the US, and ordinary people or commentators. Any individual can have their own opinion and hopefully voice their opinion, and they can call for a ceasefire if they wish. They can do so out of personal belief, moral conviction, whatever it may be. In some ways, they have the luxury of being able to voice their opinion. A leader of a country or an organisation such as the UN, for example, perhaps, does not have that same luxury. They have to be extremely careful about what they say, when they say it, how they say it. And this is something that in the current political debate seems to be overlooked or ignored. And of course, it's understandable because many people have a strong emotional reaction to this issue. They have strong personal views. But leadership, whilst many people would talk about leadership being based upon conviction and having your own principles and so on and so forth, when you're in charge of millions of other people, doing right by those people is a different thing from just adhering to your own personal principles. So what do I mean by this? Take account of all the comments I've made earlier in this video. What is a mediator? What do they have to do? How do they find areas of alignment? Now I've put a bleak assessment that right now Hamas and the Israeli government don't have any areas of alignment. So it's worth asking the question, what value does it have for the leader of any country to call for a ceasefire? Can they get the Israeli government and Hamas to align on the idea of a ceasefire? And if the answer to that question is no, then they probably should not make that call. This is not a moral argument. This is simply explaining things in negotiation terms. Because one of the things that you can do to undermine your credibility as a negotiator is to make a proposal that is completely unacceptable to anybody. That is just a reality. So if any country or any individual had the genuine desire to try and alleviate suffering and to try and broker a ceasefire, they have to be extremely careful about when they call for a ceasefire in that current conflict. Because, and it seems to be a polarizing issue right now, those who do call for a ceasefire are seen as being pro-Palestinian. Those who rebuff the call for a ceasefire are seen as being pro-Israeli. So the only safe course in negotiation terms for anyone who wishes to be a mediator is to say nothing, literally. Yeah, and that is a very difficult thing to ask people to do in the current scenario. But in negotiation terms, sometimes saying nothing really is the best answer. Because what that individual is doing is not picking a side. They're not advocating one side or another, not advocating a position. That doesn't mean there's certain things they couldn't do. So leaders could remind everybody, for example, of the rules of war, that civilians should not be targeted, hospitals should not be targeted, etc., etc. And I suppose you could upset both sides equally by doing such a thing. Of course, if you don't want to upset any side, you just don't say anything. So that is a little bit the dilemma that leaders face, because those who do call for ceasefires or those who advocate against ceasefires right now are essentially picking a side. And when hostilities do end, or at least calm down a bit, when everyone comes round to the negotiation table, everybody will have a position or a preconception on which side those leaders fell on. There'd be the pro-Israeli side, there'd be the pro-Palestinian side, and there'll be a very, very small number of people in between those two polarized points. And I suppose this is the thing that has to be borne in mind when advocating for a ceasefire, that you're advocating for a position, and rightly or wrongly, one side or the other will view that position in different ways. And so, as a consequence of advocating that position, you cannot then act as a mediator at a future point, as a consequence of that perception. So in my final remarks, I will end with these 3 big points. The first one is timing. And this is the thing many people get wrong in negotiations. Very often people go to negotiation with positions that they want to advocate. And that's what you should be doing. You should have your positions. You should have proposals that you want to make. But the mistake that people make is they do it too early. So timing is crucial in terms of getting your positions, your proposals accepted. Go in too soon, you get rejected. Go in too late even, and you perhaps miss the boat. So in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, calling for a ceasefire, for example, within the first month of that conflict is arguably, in negotiation terms, going in too early. And anyone doing so will simply be ignored, probably by both sides. That does not mean that you could never call for a ceasefire. It just means you have to figure out when is the right time to do so. And I don't have any answer when is the right time to do so. I don't think anybody has. It could be in a month's time. It could be in a year's time. It's likely to be somewhere in between those 2 points, I suspect. So who knows? But whoever wishes to advocate for a ceasefire, they need to get the timing right, that they advocate for it at a point where both sides are willing to listen. And the point I wish to make here is that both sides are perhaps not willing to listen, and so you do not want to advocate that position, because to do so reduces the trust and credibility that you might have. So what is crucial to being effective in terms of helping the situation is to maintain trust and credibility. And that is not, of course, easy, but in any negotiation, that is essential. So for any world leader that wants to be able to alleviate the pain of the Palestinian people, they need to maintain trust and credibility with both sides in order to do so. And that means they need to be extremely careful about what they say and what they do. And the final point is, it doesn't matter how good you are as a negotiator. If both sides do not want to negotiate, then they do not want to negotiate. You cannot force people to agree to do things against their will. Now, some people may take a view to that, a different view. And sure, I suppose if you're willing to turn up with a large army, invade and impose your will, then yes, you could impose a ceasefire on both sides. Although I have to admit, I would not want to be in a military stuck between those two. That would be an extremely unhappy place to be. And everybody knows that, which is why nobody is volunteering to do it. No one's volunteering to impose a ceasefire because no one wants to be the one that has to enforce it. So therefore, for example, the issue of ceasefire only comes about when both sides are in a position of willing to agree to it. So in the meantime, all people can do is advocate what they consider might be acceptable positions. So they might consider humanitarian aid. They might consider allowing people to evacuate the war zone, which are perhaps small things that both sides could agree on. And step by step, those wishing to alleviate this conflict can perhaps build that trust, build that credibility, and at a later point advocate stronger positions that they hope both sides will accept, and thus in their own way make themselves effective at dealing with the situation. And I'm choosing my words carefully here because what is a good outcome? And in negotiation terms, I talk about trying to achieve, your goals, your successful outcomes. It is very hard. There is no short-term fix to achieving a successful outcome here. There is just step-by-step achieving less worse outcomes until perhaps you reach some form of parity, and then in the really long distance perhaps advocating for something that will start to look more like peace, start to look more like a more harmonious settlement where the two sides can at the very least get along without trying to murder each other. That is having to be realistic about your goals and having to have a really long-term strategy in terms of getting there. Which is the final point perhaps I really should make, is right now I am not seeing any evidence of anyone with a strategy for dealing with this issue. Whether that's Israeli, whether that's Hamas, whether that's anyone who wishes to somehow influence that conflict, no one at this time has a credible strategy. And when you don't have that, it is very hard to achieve any kind of goal or successful outcome. And this is extremely important to remember in the context of what is going on right now. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope I've explained things in a thoughtful and sensitive way, because this is a difficult topic for many people, I understand, and I hope that this in its own small way helps to influence people's thinking, and that when they do engage, whether politically or on a personal level, they bear some of these points in mind when advocating for any particular course of action. So thank you very much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing the comments below.